What if your home was nearly stolen with a lie on paper? That's what a black man faced when his HOA filed fake liens against his property, hoping silence would bury the truth. Their confidence shattered when he revealed the lawyer they'd hired wasn't theirs at all. He was his. Imagine this. The neighborhood looked perfect, almost too perfect. Lawns stretched out in precise green squares, fences gleamed white under the sun, and mailboxes stood like obedient soldiers in a row. But perfection has a way of hiding cracks. Beneath the quiet order was something sharper. Rules that did not bend, power that did not ask, and silence that covered more than it revealed. He moved in believing he had earned peace. What he did not know was that the peace was a performance, and he had been cast as the disruption. Karen, one of the HOA board members, leaned against her porch railing the first day he arrived. Karen says, "Hope you know the rules here are strict." He smiled politely, carrying boxes from his car. Marcus replies, "Good. Rules keep things fair." Her silence afterward felt heavier than words, the first signal that fair meant different things depending on who was listening. The first letter came tucked neatly inside his mailbox, folded with bureaucratic precision. Inside, a notice of unpaid dues, a false claim, a paper weapon, part of a pattern of HOA harassment case. He knew it was false. He had receipts. But paper is not always about truth. It is about power. At the next meeting, the board insisted, "Our records disagree. Rules are rules." The gavel fell. This was no mistake. It was design. A system built on selective enforcement HOA meant to test his resolve. What they didn't realize was that he was keeping every letter, every false claim, every lie. Each notice meant to break him became evidence. And when the truth came out, that he had turned the tables and owned their lawyer, the silence that once suffocated the neighborhood became shock instead. Marcus says, "These liens are false. I've kept every record. I've paid every due." The board president adjusted his glasses, calm and dismissive. President says, "Our records show otherwise. If you have an issue, take it up through official channels." Marcus lifted a folder thick with proof. Marcus says, "These are your official channels. Every payment, every receipt. Your claims are lies." Whispers rippled through the room. Some gasped softly, others shook their heads. Most sat still, eyes forward, refusing to intervene. Karen, seated at the board center, leaned into her microphone. Karen says, "Rules don't bend for renters or owners who can't follow them." Marcus replies, steady, "Then maybe your records are broken." The gavel slammed again, cutting the air like thunder. The meeting adjourned, his evidence dismissed without review. People filed out quickly, avoiding his eyes. He stood alone in the center of the hall, folder clutched tight, surrounded by silence heavier than any verdict. Outside, rain began to fall. It tapped against his fence like fingers drumming out a warning. He walked past it, soaked, but unbowed. The storm outside mirrored the one within, gathering, relentless, waiting for its moment to break. Nights stretched longer. He sat at his desk, law books spread wide, laptop glowing through the early hours. He researched property law, liens, and HOA statutes. His notes filled yellow pads, his receipts lined in chronological order. Each false claim he answered with fact, each notice countered with evidence. He was not trained in law, yet necessity makes its own experts. What they thought would drown him in confusion, he turned into study. What they meant as intimidation, he gathered as proof. Still, the attacks worsened. Another notice arrived, this one more brutal. A threat of foreclosure. His home, his sanctuary, reduced to a line on a page. He held it in trembling hands. For a moment, doubt gnawed at him. Could they take everything? Could lies really strip away what he had earned? That evening, he visited another neighbor, an older man who had always waved kindly. He knocked, letter in hand. The man opened slowly, eyes weary. Marcus says, "You've lived here long enough to know their games. Have you seen this before?" The old man hesitated. Neighbor says, "You should be careful. They don't like troublemakers. Best to pay, stay quiet." Marcus replies, "Pay for lies? Stay quiet for fraud?" The man lowered his eyes. Neighbor says, "Sometimes silence is the only way to survive." The door shut gently, but the words slammed like a verdict. Silence again, silence chosen. Silence was not absence. It was presence. It was complicity. It weighed more than lies, more than paper. It gave corruption the breath it needed to thrive. At the next meeting, he tried again. He spoke with precision, laying out dates, figures, receipts. But the board smiled thinly, unfazed. Karen says, "Perhaps you misunderstand how records are kept." Marcus replies, "Perhaps you misunderstand how truth is kept." The room tensed. Some shifted uneasily in their seats. Others avoided looking at him. The silence became suffocating, a crowd of ghosts pretending neutrality. A viral crack split the quiet. A younger neighbor, phone in hand, recorded the exchange. His words cut, sharp. Marcus says, "One day this silence will belong to history, and history will remember who chose to speak and who chose to hide." The video spread online that night. Comments flooded in. Why are they targeting him? This looks wrong. Typical HOA corruption. But the board struck back quickly, issuing a statement. The video misrepresents the facts. The homeowner is delinquent. Many believed them, others didn't. The silence within the neighborhood held firm. Awareness without action, sympathy without risk. Behind closed doors, the HOA hardened its strategy. They held private meetings, announced decisions as final without input. Their corruption was methodical, bureaucratic, and smug. They knew the power of process. Every closed door, every filed paper, every ignored appeal. In one dimly lit session, Karen whispered to the treasurer. Karen says, "He's drowning. Keep pressing. The more paper, the more he sinks." Treasurer says, "What if he fights harder?" Karen smirked. Karen says, "Then we'll call it defiance. Defiance never wins here." They mistook resilience for defiance, truth for nuisance. But the more they pressed, the sharper his preparation became. At his desk, Marcus worked, tirelessly. He pinned every notice to the wall, strings connecting dates, amounts, signatures. The wall looked like a detective's hunt for a killer. In truth, it was. The killer was corruption, hiding in ink. He whispered to himself as he wrote. Marcus says, "Every lie leaves a trail. Every fraud leaves a fingerprint. And when the time comes, they won't escape their own signatures." Wah. Storm gathered. The silence pressed in. But under that silence, a fire burned. Not just to survive, but to overturn the system that had underestimated him. And somewhere in the distance, behind the closed door of a law office, waited the piece of truth that would transform everything. The lawyer they thought would save them. The lawyer they did not know was his. The fourth week opened with a wind that rattled shutters and made fences creak. He stood at the curb with an empty bin in his hand, staring at the mailbox as if it might finally show mercy. It didn't. 3 envelopes lay inside, all identical, all stamped with the same seal. He carried them back like small bombs, placed them on the kitchen table and sliced them open with the same steady motion he had practiced like a ritual. The first claimed a late fee for a month he had paid early. The second announced a compliance violation for excessive fence height, though his fence matched the standard to the inch. The third warned that further delinquency may result in legal escalation, paper as pressure, ink as intimidation. He filed each letter into its folder, then stood before the wall where strings linked dates to signatures and signatures to names. He chose to go beyond meetings and polite arguments. He went to the county records office, the place where truths were supposed to be kept behind glass and timestamps. The clerk sat behind a smudged window, tapping a pen against a ledger. "Marcus," says, "I need to see recorded liens on my property." The clerk flipped through entries, then peered at the screen. Clerk says, "There are none recorded." Marcus replies, "The HOA says there are multiple." The clerk frowned. Clerk says, "If it's not in our records, it's not legal. Ask for certified copies. If they can't provide them, something's wrong." He left with a printout that stated what the board refused to admit: no recorded liens. The paper crackled in his hand like a match waiting for a flame. He photographed it, date-stamped it, slid it into a clear sleeve, pinned it to the center of the wall, and drew 2 bold lines to the names that had signed his notices. Pens had made those threats. His pen would write their undoing. That evening, the neighborhood behaved like a theater during intermission. People stood in small clumps by their fences, sipping from cups, pretending not to watch him. Neighbor says, "He went to the county today." Another lowered her voice. Neighbor says, "If the board said it, it must be true." A young father adjusted his ball cap and glanced away. Neighbor says, "Truth is expensive out here. Safer to nod." Their words drifted like a fog that refused to lift. He posted a message to the community forum, attaching the county printout and a scan of his receipts. The thread lit up, comments stacking fast. User says, "If there are no recorded liens, what is the HOA sending?" Another replied in defense. User says, "Private associations have their own processes. Stay out of it." A third tried to split the difference. User says, "Let's wait for an official response." By nightfall, the post vanished, flagged as contentious. He received a message in his inbox from an address he didn't recognize. Anonymous says, "You're right." They know it. Check board minutes from June. The vote didn't happen like they say. He stared at the screen, pulse quickening. Doors that had seemed sealed were cracking. He requested the minutes. The management company replied with a polite stone wall. Manager says, "Records are internal. Requests must come through formal counsel." Marcus replies, "Cite the rule that lets you deny access to minutes." No answer came. Another door, another silent corridor. He printed the email anyway, pinned it to the wall under the June meeting tag, and drew a line from the unanswered question to the signature block bearing Karen's name. A week later, a plain manila envelope arrived with no return address. Inside were photocopies of emails between 2 board members. The pages looked washed in the gray of a bad copier, but the words cut clean. Board member number 1 says, "Make an example of him. Backdate the notice to align with the policy." Board member number 2 says, "Karen wants it aggressive. She said he needs to feel it." He stood there with the pages trembling slightly, the kitchen clock ticking too loudly. He scanned each page, uploaded them to a hidden folder, then slid the originals into a plastic sleeve and taped them beneath a heading he wrote in ink, "Backdating." At the next meeting, the room smelled faintly of coffee and anxiety. He waited until the agenda's end, when the crowd had thinned and a hush settled like dust. Marcus says, "I have a question about the June minutes." Karen didn't look up from her stack. Karen says, "We have concluded public comments." He laid a photocopy on the table, the one line in bold. Marcus says, "Is backdating a recognized policy?" The treasurer stiffened. Treasurer says, "That's private correspondence." Marcus replies, "Private corruption isn't an exemption." Ripple went through the crowd, a soft gasp, then the quick, skittering silence of people afraid their eyes might say too much. Karen tapped the gavel against the table, the sound brittle, too fast. Karen says, "Meeting adjourned." He stepped into the hallway as phones came up. A teenager whispered to his friend. Teen says, "He just dropped emails." Friend says, "They looked real." A mother held her toddler close and watched him with cautious eyes. Mother says, "I hope he wins." Her voice carried the hush of a prayer. In the days that followed, he organized what he had into a structure that could hold in a storm. A timeline on the left, a column of signatures down the right, a center channel of rules and statutes highlighted in yellow. The wall became less a collage and more a case. Every notice that once pressed him down now hung there as if waiting to testify. The pen on his desk lay still, like a witness resting before it spoke. A new letter arrived, this one with a harsher tone, printed in a darker font, as if the ink itself had been told to grow teeth. Final notice. Foreclosure proceedings imminent. He read it twice, then a third time, scanning the dates and misstatements with surgical care. He drafted a response, mailed it certified, and kept the receipt pinned under a pushpin shaped like a small silver gavel. He sought counsel, not for permission, but for timing. He walked past a glass door etched with a firm's name. The lobby smelled of paper and winter air. The receptionist glanced up, then down at her screen. Receptionist says, "Do you have an appointment?" Marcus replies, "I know the right person to see." He left without giving a name, a faint, private calm in his steps. He didn't need to ask whether this firm had recently received a call from a certain HOA. Some doors open when they have to. Others open because you already have the key. The neighborhood reacted as neighborhoods do when a center of gravity shifts. Some people looked at him with a new weight in their gaze. Others recoiled as if truth were contagious. Neighbor says, "He's stirring up trouble." Another shook his head. Neighbor says, "He's exposing it." A third watched from a porch swing, arms crossed, face unreadable. Neighbor says, "If the board falls, the whole street changes." And from a window, someone half drawn behind a curtain whispered to no one, to everyone. Neighbor says, "Maybe it should." A second viral moment sparked when a screenshot of the "make an example of him" email surfaced on a neighborhood chat app and jumped to a public feed. The comments multiplied. User says, "This is fraud, period." Another added, user says, "If this is true, resignations now." A different voice tried to slow the surge. User says, "We need context." But the context had already begun to write itself. He filed complaints with the State Consumer Protection Unit and the Real Estate Division overseeing HOA governance. He attached scanned notices, the county printout, and the leaked emails. Numbered his exhibits, labeled them with the same patient hand that had labeled receipts on the first night he realized paper would be his battleground. He mailed the packets with tracking, photographed the counterslips, and saved the images twice. On a Saturday morning, kids rode bikes in lazy loops, while parents traded small talk at the end of the cul-de-sac. He walked past with a folder under his arm. A man in a golf shirt shifted to block his path casually, like a turn in conversation. Resident says, "You could end this by paying something. A compromise keeps things civil." Marcus replies, "Compromise with a lie invites a bigger one." Resident says, "But the neighborhood." Marcus replies, "The neighborhood is watching. That's the point." Across the street, a woman stood with her arms folded, nodding almost imperceptibly. On Monday, a paper appeared on his door, taped at an angle, corners flapping. "Notice of intent to foreclose." The tape left, a residue like a bruise. He peeled it off slowly, smoothed it flat on the table, and photographed it from 3 angles. The door stood behind him like a witness that wished it had a voice. He visited the management office. A receptionist offered a smile that didn't reach her eyes. Marcus says, "I want to see the payment ledger. My payments. Your postings." Side by side. Receptionist says, "That requires a written request." Marcus replies, "I made one. I have the timestamp." She disappeared into a back room. The door thudded shut, then opened, then shut again. A man emerged with a practiced expression. Manager says, "We'll coordinate through counsel." Marcus replies, "Which counsel?" The man blinked, cautious. Manager says, "Announcement forthcoming." Marcus nodded once, as if he had received a long-awaited answer. That night, he pulled old boxes from a closet and found a thin album tucked between folders. A flash of a younger self at a courthouse steps photo, the day he closed on his first rental property. A caption from his aunt in ink that hadn't faded. "Keep every document. One day paper will save you." The memory cut clean. He rested the album back with care and returned to the table, where the present waited hungry for precision. The next HOA meeting felt like a prelude to something bigger. The room was packed, aisles lined, walls pressed with bodies and murmurs. He arrived early with a rolling cart, boxes stacked neatly, labels visible, tabs color-coded. The cartwheels squeaked like a warning. He parked it by a chair and folded his hands. Karen scanned the crowd and rapped the gavel too hard. The head loosened and rattled. A thin laugh died in someone's throat. Karen says, "We will maintain order." He stood before the agenda, even began. Marcus says, "I have evidence the board falsified notices, backdated correspondence, and claimed liens that do not exist at the county." A board member clenched his jaw. Board member says, "Sit down or be removed." Marcus replies, "Remove. Me and watch how far that video travels." Phones went up in a shimmer of glass. A low wave of whispers rolled across the room and broke against the stage. He opened the top box and took out a binder. The first tab read, "Payments." He laid down a receipt, then another, then a ledger printed from his bank with the same dates and amounts. Marcus says, "Do you dispute these?" Silence pooled like oil. Karen says, "We don't conduct audits publicly." He placed the county printout beside the receipts. Marcus replies, "You already did. You tried to conduct a foreclosure in public." A smatter of claps flickered, then stopped at the sight of the gavel rising. He kept his voice even. Marcus says, "To the neighbors who were told I was delinquent, you were given a story. Here is the record." A man in the back called out. Resident says, "If the liens aren't recorded, what exactly did you file?" Karen's smile held no temperature. Karen says, "Sir, please wait for official communication." A woman folded her arms. Resident says, "We've been waiting." He set down the photocopied emails and watched the color drain from faces that still pretended composure. Marcus says, "Which of you instructed backdating?" No answer came. The silence was different now. Not protective, but cornered. After the meeting, under the humming exit lights, he felt the energy shift in the crowd. A man touched his arm briefly. Neighbor says, "I was wrong." Marcus replies, "Truth corrects more than people." A teenager lifted his phone. Teen says, "They're saying the board hired Counsel." He looked at the screen. A message screenshot in a group chat, a name he knew as well as his own breath. He didn't react, didn't flinch. He simply nodded, as if the final piece had taken its seat without needing a chair pulled out for it. The board, rattled but defiant, posted a statement asserting full compliance and appropriate legal representation. The statement landed with a thud. Within an hour, someone posted the manila envelope line about "make an example," this time with the email headers visible. The crowd splintered. Some circled wagons. Others began to count wagons. He filed one more packet, this one to the district attorney's intake. He kept his language clinical, his claims precise, his attachments labeled cleanly. He didn't ask for outcomes. He delivered a record, and trusted processes hobbled by politics might still remember how to walk. At dawn the next day, dew beaded on every fence post like a string of glass beads. He wheeled the cart from his living room to the front door and paused with his hand on the knob. The door felt like a line he had crossed many times. Today it felt like a line others would have to cross with him. He stepped outside and saw something he hadn't seen in weeks. Two neighbors waiting on the sidewalk, hands in pockets, eyes open. One spoke first. Neighbor says, "We'll be in the room." The other nodded once. Neighbor says, It's time. The hearing notice came by courier at noon. Date, time, rules of presentation. He read the fine print twice. The place chosen was a boardroom that pretended to be a courtroom, fluorescent lights, a table too long for truth, a clock that would not stop for anyone's heartbeat. He wrote the time in his planner, then underlined it. He placed the notice beside a small object he had bought at a thrift store months earlier, a miniature gavel made of dark wood. He balanced it in his palm, felt its weight, set it down gently. He prepared witnesses quietly, the county clerk willing to certify records, a former board volunteer ready to explain the real process for votes, the anonymous tipster who preferred to send a sworn letter rather than appear in person. He printed statements and slipped them into sleeves. He rehearsed nothing out loud. Words lose edge when they are sharpened too often in the air. He saved his edge for the table where pens would scratch and eyes would try not to blink. 2 nights before the hearing, a final paper arrived, slapped against his door. Immediate payment demand. He peeled it off carefully and held it at arm's length, as if it might smear. Marcus says, "You've made enough noise with paper." He placed it on the wall last, far to the right, a bookend to the first notice that had started all of it. He stood back, looked at the arc from threat to proof, from proof to pattern, from pattern to plan. The wall no longer looked like defense. It looked like a launch. The morning of the hearing, cars lined the street. People emerged in that hushed, attire communities wear when they sense history pressing against their cul-de-sac. He slid binders into boxes, snapped lids tight, and rolled the cart out over the threshold. The door clicked shut behind him, not with finality, but with focus. Across the street, children stopped their bikes and watched, their faces serious in a way that made the air hold still. Karen stood by her car, speaking into a phone with a face that tried to look unfazed and failed. Karen says, "Yes, Counsel will handle him." He passed within earshot without turning his head. Marcus replies, just loud enough, "Counsel will do what counsel must." A neighbor watched him go and whispered to another. Neighbor says, "He sounds certain." The reply floated back like an answer meant for the day itself. Neighbor says, "Maybe certainty is what paper feared." The boardroom doors were heavy and reflective, showing each person themselves before they entered. He pushed one open with his shoulder, the cart rolling forward, the wheels making that small squeak again. People filed in, whispering. For once, the silence didn't belong to the board. It hovered between everyone equally, waiting to choose its side. He set the boxes down by a chair near the end of the long table where witnesses usually sat and looked at the empty seat at the far side, reserved for the HOA's counsel. He rested his hand briefly on the lid of the top box and felt the hum of the room through the plastic. He took a calm breath and waited. The clock ticked to the minute on the notice. The door at the far end opened, shoes clicked, a suit appeared, eyes lifted around the room to see who had come to speak for the board that had spoken so easily for months. He looked up once, briefly, and the faintest curve of understanding moved through his face. The crowd leaned forward as if pulled by a single rope. The hearing officer cleared his throat, pens poised, phones tucked into palms. The gavel at the center sat still, a promise waiting to be kept. And then the room held one long breath, as if even air stepped back to watch what truth would do when it finally reached the table. The boardroom was colder than expected. Fluorescent lights hummed overhead, throwing a sterile glow across polished wood. At one end, the HOA board lined up like a tribunal, faces set in masks of practiced authority. At the other, he sat beside his cart of boxes, hands folded, expression calm. Between them stretched a table long enough to make truth feel far away. The crowd filled the seats behind, whispering in currents that rose and fell like restless waves. The air held a hush so dense it almost had weight. The hearing officer cleared his throat. Officer says, "We will review claims regarding liens and compliance violations. Both parties will present." His voice was monotone, designed for neutrality, but the tremor in his hand as he adjusted papers revealed he knew the room carried more than procedure. Karen leaned slightly forward, confidence sharpened into every line of her posture. Karen says, "This homeowner has failed to comply with repeated requests. He is delinquent, in violation, and obstructive. The association seeks foreclosure as remedy." Her words landed like iron filings scattered on the table. Marcus stood slowly, pushing the first box forward with a quiet scrape. He opened the lid and drew out a binder. He flipped it open with care, laying the first page flat. Marcus says, "Exhibit 1. Payment receipts. Every due, on time, stamped and cleared." He slid the papers across. Pens scribbled. The crowd leaned forward. Marcus says, "Exhibit 2. County Clerk certification. No liens recorded. None." The officer looked up, startled. The board members shifted slightly, but Karen held her stillness. A man in the crowd whispered too loudly. Resident says, "If." "No liens are recorded. What's he fighting?" Another murmured back. Resident says, "Paper ghosts." The whisper spread like static, silenced only by the officer's gavel. Karen smiled faintly, as if she had been waiting for this. Karen says, "Private associations have authority outside county filings. Records maintained internally are valid and binding." Marcus replied with precision. Marcus says, "Authority isn't invention. Authority must anchor to law. What you have is paper without anchor, ink without foundation, fraud with a letterhead." The crowd gasped. A few clapped before stopping themselves, glancing nervously at the officer. He reached into the second box and pulled out the manila copies. The photocopied emails. He laid them out one by one, the lines bolded in ink, the words cutting. Marcus says, "Exhibit 3. Internal correspondence. Instruction to backdate. Instruction to make an example. Signed by board members here present." The silence snapped into sound. Gasps, whispers, the low hum of disbelief. Phones rose, screens glowing, recording every flick of expression across the board's faces. The treasurer's hand twitched toward the papers. Treasurer says, "These are stolen. Inadmissible." Marcus's eyes locked steady. Marcus says, "Truth doesn't need permission. Fraud doesn't need privacy." The officer hesitated, then nodded slowly. The papers stayed on the table. Storm outside seemed to lean against the windows, rain tapping hard as if echoing the rising tension. He drew a line with his finger across the exhibits. Marcus says, "Payments made, liens unrecorded, fraud instructed, and yet, foreclosure." "Sort, tell me, who is delinquent here?" The crowd murmured louder now, like a tide pulling back to surge. A woman near the back whispered sharply. Resident says, "They lied. We all knew, and we stayed quiet." Her voice cracked, but no one silenced her this time. Karen tapped her pen once, twice. Karen says, "These claims are exaggerated. The board retains counsel who will clarify matters shortly." She leaned back, calm restored like a mask adjusted. The crowd shifted, expectation tilting toward the door. Counsel was coming. He closed the binder softly and leaned on the table with both hands. Marcus says, "Let them come." The cliffhanger hung in the room, the crowd holding breath. The door opened at the far end. Shoes clicked on tile. A suit stepped into view, briefcase swinging. The crowd straightened, leaning as if to see more clearly. Authority entered the room embodied in a lawyer's stride, measured, polished, carrying centuries of precedent in his calm. The officer looked relieved, as if order had finally arrived. Officer says, "Counsel for the association, please proceed." But the lawyer didn't move to the board's side. He paused, scanning the room, eyes sharp and knowing. Then he turned, walked the length of the table and set his briefcase down. Beside Marcus, a ripple of shock rolled through the crowd like a gust of wind slamming shutters. Karen's pen froze mid-air. The treasurer's mouth opened, closed. Whispers erupted. Resident says, "What just happened?" Another hissed. Resident says, "He's with him. He's theirs." The lawyer spoke calmly, voice carrying with deliberate weight. Lawyer says, "For the record, this firm represents Mr. Marcus. Any documents bearing our signature are under his authority." The crowd gasped. A phone clattered to the floor. Silence swept, then returned sharper, heavier than ever before. Marcus sat back, hands folded again, voice quiet but devastating. Marcus says, "The pen you trusted was mine all along." Karen's face drained of color. She whispered, not into the mic, but to herself. Karen says, "Impossible." Marcus replied evenly, audible to all. Marcus says, "You tried to weaponize counsel, but you walked into my house with my lawyer." The crowd erupted. Gasps turned into full voices. Some laughed in disbelief, others cursed under breath. A teenager muttered to his friend. Teen says, "He owns their lawyer." Friend says, "No way, record it." Phones flashed, screens filled with frantic typing. Viral fuel ignited in real time. The officer struck his gavel hard, the sound barely cutting through the uproar. Officer says, "Order. This is a formal proceeding." But order was gone. Authority had flipped. The silence that once belonged to the board now suffocated them. Marcus lifted one final document from the last box, a retainer agreement, signed, stamped. He laid it flat for all to see. Marcus says, "The association's fraud ends here. Every threat they made, every notice they filed, every lie they signed, they did under the authority of my counsel." The crowd rose, murmurs turning into sharp declarations. Resident says, "It's over." Another. Resident says, "Expose." "Them all." Karen tried to gather her words, but they scattered before forming. Her hands shook as she pressed the mic button. Karen says, We were misled." Marcus replied, steady as stone. Marcus says, "No, you misled." And the silence you counted on has broken. The storm outside boomed, lightning flashing against the windows, illuminating faces frozen in disbelief. And as the lawyer nodded quietly beside him, the camera of the moment turned not to him, not to the board, but to the crowd, neighbors holding phones, gasping, whispering, their silence forever broken, their complicity forever recorded. The room held the kind of silence that remembers itself. Pens hovered, a gavel waited, and eyes drifted between the board and the man who had just turned the table into a mirror. The storm outside shrugged rain against the glass, impatient for the next strike. The hearing officer looked from the retainer, agreement to the board, then back to Marcus and the lawyer beside him. Officer says, "To be clear, your firm represents Mr. Marcus, not the association." Lawyer says, "Correct, and we have already issued notice of conflict to all parties, attempting to retain us in opposition." Karen's jaw set. Karen says, "We were not aware." Marcus replies, "You were warned, in writing. You ignored it." The lawyer slid a copy of the conflict letter across the table. The header shone under the fluorescent light like a small, hard moon. A board member reached for the paper, hands shaking. Board member says, "We assumed, we were told." Marcus replies, "Assumptions are not law." The crowd shifted, the air tightening. Someone in the back whispered, like a breath pulled through teeth. Resident says, "They knew. They just hoped it wouldn't matter." The officer steadied his voice. Officer says, "Proceed with evidence relevant to the claims." Marcus opened. Another binder, pages tabbed in a fan of colors. Marcus says, "Timeline of notices cross-referenced with bank records. Cross-referenced with HOA minutes, where minutes exist. Where they don't, we have metadata." Karen tried to interrupt, but he laid down the printouts in a precise row. Marcus says, "This file shows creation dates changed 2 days after the meeting they cite. Backdating." The treasurer's pen slipped and made a slash across his own notes. Phones came up again like a field of tiny mirrors. The room vibrated with a soft electric tremor as messages began leaping outward. A cut scene flashed in memory. A split screen of thumbs typing, a clip titled, "He owns their lawyer," already looping with captions, comments catching fire, fraud, conflict, justice turning. Karen drew breath as if surfacing from deep water. Karen says, "Even if there were irregularities, the homeowner has repeatedly been non-compliant." Marcus replies, "Non-compliant with lies." He tapped a single receipt that bore a bank, stamp and a time. Marcus says, "Paid, posted, ignored." The officer motioned to the side door. Officer says, "We will hear from the county clerk." A clerk stepped in, rain still freckling his shoulders. He held up a certified record. Clerk says, "No liens recorded against this property. If any claim exists, it is extrajudicial and unenforceable without proper filing." The words struck like clean hammer blows. The gavel didn't have to move. The truth sounded its own wood. A man in the front row exhaled loudly. Resident says, "They tried to steal his house with paper." A woman beside him pressed a hand to her mouth. Resident says, "And we watched." Marcus set down the manila copies, those leaked emails with their gray haze and sharp edges. Marcus says, "Instruction to backdate, instruction to make." An example. Names attached. Karen stared at the table as if searching it for an exit. Karen says, "We did what was necessary to maintain standards." Marcus replies, "You weaponize standards." The officer turned pages with slow, deliberate fingers. Officer says, "Pending final finding, the foreclosure process is suspended. The board will refrain from any enforcement action connected to these notices until review is complete." There was a soft ripple of relief, then a harder ripple of anger, moving in opposite directions through the crowd like currents that had finally met. The lawyer spoke without raising his voice. Lawyer says, "We will also pursue sanctions, requests for records, and if necessary, referral for criminal inquiry." The room inhaled. The gavel lowered but did not strike. It only hovered, a symbol, finally restored to meaning. One board member stood too fast, chair legs screeching. Board member says, "This is a witch hunt." Marcus turned his head just slightly. Marcus says, "Witches leave no receipts." "You did." Laughter spiked, then flattened to a hush when the officer lifted a hand. The storm flickered against the windows like a shuttered reel. Another sharp cut. A grainy flashback of a grandmother lifting a notice from a door in the 1980s. The word "delinquent" stamped in red while neighbors watched from porches. No words, only the long stare of a neighborhood that understood silence as a practice. The image collapsed back into the present, where silence had finally fractured. Karen adjusted the mic, voice brittle. Karen says, "The board regrets any confusion. We will conduct an internal audit." Marcus replies, "You'll conduct it under an external light." He pointed to the crowd, the phones, the clerk, the officer. Marcus says, "This is your audit." A teenager near the aisle spoke, not to anyone particular, but to the moment. Teen says, "The fence looks different now." His friend glanced toward the window, where white slats gleamed wet and new. Friend says, "Maybe it was never about the fence." The officer nodded toward the exhibits. Officer says, "Enter all as part of the record." The court reporter's keys started their staccato, writing the sound of the room into permanence. Karen turned to whisper to the treasurer. Her mic picked up the hush. Karen says, "We can resign, regroup, and survive this." The treasurer shook his head with the slow gravity of someone stepping away from a cliff. Treasurer says, "We already fell." Marcus gathered the last set of documents. Marcus says, "List of residents charged inconsistent fees compared to their neighbors. Names redacted for now." The crowd stiffened, heads turned in quick darts. Resident says, "They overcharged us too?" Another voice came raw. Resident says, "Say the names." Marcus shook his head. Marcus says, "Not mine to expose, but it's yours to demand." The lawyer placed a letter on the table, seal unbroken, addressed to the board. Lawyer says, "Cease and desist regarding foreclosure and defamatory statements. Service acknowledged by presence." He slid it toward Karen with the small mercy of a quiet hand. The officer leaned forward, elbows on the table, a tired man steadying a ship that had already chosen its direction. Officer says, "The board will produce unedited minutes, unaltered copies of notices, and server logs for file creation and modification. Deadline, 5 business days." Karen stared as if hearing a foreign language. Karen says, "Server logs?" Marcus replies, "Dates don't lie." Phones vibrated like a hive. Another cutscene spread outward. A local reporter's tweet. Hearing halted. Foreclosure suspended. Board accused of backdating. Viral moment. Homeowner's counsel turns out to be his. The thread stacked under the earlier clip until the feed became a ladder. A door creaked at the back. Some neighbors, who had stood the entire time, slipped out quietly, eyes down. Others edged closer, drawn like filings to a magnet. A mother with a toddler on her hip looked at Marcus, the way people look at a lighthouse after counting every wave between themselves and shore. Mother says, "Thank you." Marcus replies, "Hold them accountable. That's how it lasts." Karen's voice came back ironed flat. Karen says, "We will consult new counsel." Marcus replies, "Choose one you don't have to borrow." A spark of laughter burst and fell. The officer let it pass like harmless thunder. The lawyer tapped the retainer agreement once, exactly where the ink looped over the firm's name. Lawyer says, "We intend to pursue attorney's fees." Karen flinched. Karen says, "On what grounds?" Lawyer says, "On the grounds you made us do our work twice." The gavel finally struck. 1, 2, 3. Officer says, "This portion of the hearing is concluded. A written order will follow." But nothing really concluded. The room did not exhale. It pivoted. People stood. The sound was not applause. It was the restless percussion of chairs pushing back, of hard shoes on harder floors, of phones snapping images of a table now covered with papers, the color of repentance. The storm eased to a quiet patter that made the windows feel like drums, played by a careful hand. Marcus closed his binders, turned a receipt face down, and looked at the boardroom door. It was heavy, reflective, and slightly ajar. A symbol he had walked through and out of, and now stood ready to hold open for others. Karen stepped away from the table, then stopped, facing the crowd for the first time without the mic. Karen says, "We acted for the good of the neighborhood." A neighbor who had said nothing for months answered without raising his voice. Neighbor says, "You acted for the fear of it." Outside the doors, the hallway gathered people into clumps of verdict and disbelief. Resident says, "They'll resign." Another rubbed her arms as if cold. Resident says, "They'll run." A third shook his head. Resident says, "They'll hide." The lawyer laid a hand on Marcus's shoulder, light as a comma. Lawyer says, "This will now move fast." Marcus replies, "Good. Silence already moved too slow." A flashback clipped across memory. A younger Marcus counting out bills at a kitchen table in a smaller apartment, saving for a down payment, while a television on mute showed another family on another block losing what they'd built to a notice they didn't deserve. The image blinked away, replaced by a hallway filled with people who finally couldn't pretend not to see. He stepped outside beneath the awning where the rain had thinned into a thread. The fence across the parking lot marked the boundary between the office complex and a slice of neighborhood. Clean lines, wet slats, a small gate hanging open. A bird shook itself on the top rail, sending droplets into the air like bright punctuation. Two board members hurried past with their shoulders up around their ears. Board member says, "No statements." A voice followed like a soft net. Resident says, "Then we'll make one without you." He walked home slowly, taking the sidewalk that ran parallel to the fence line. The white posts flickered by in a rhythm, countable, finite, conquerable. His front door was still marked by the faint square where the intent to foreclose had been taped. He pressed a palm against the wood and felt the house breathe. Or maybe it was just him. On the porch, a neighbor stood waiting, one who had once closed his door with a warning. The man's hat was in his hands now. Neighbor says, "I told you to stay quiet." Marcus replies, "Silence almost made me lose more than money." The neighbor nodded, eyes damp. Neighbor says, "I'll speak at the next meeting." Marcus replies, "Then make it count for the ones after, too." His phone chimed. A message from the management company, stripped of warmth. Board will schedule emergency session. Enforcement actions on hold. He took a breath that reached his heels. The fence beside the porch looked less like a warning and more like a line drawn before a new map. Night fell without drama, only the soft scuff of wind across the street and the occasional car rolling past like a thought that wouldn't stay. He sat at his table, the wall of exhibits no longer a wall so much as a window. Dates aligned into cents, signatures stitched into a pattern, misuses of power pulled tight enough to show their shape. The next day opened clean. The HOA posted an announcement online, formal, spare, its sentences as short as clipped fingernails. The board announces the resignation of the treasurer, secretary, and 2 members at large. An interim committee will oversee records production. The comments that followed didn't split so easily this time. Resident says, "Accountability begins." Another added a line that landed like a stone in a pond. Resident says, "We let it happen." By afternoon, the local reporter stood on the sidewalk with a cameraman. The segment was brief, just enough to say the hearing paused the foreclosure, just enough to show the clip where the lawyer took his seat beside Marcus. The anchor's voiceover called it a rare inversion of power in a suburban dispute. The phrase echoed through living rooms like a bell with no church to claim it. He returned to the boardroom that evening for a documents handoff. A box sat on the table labeled Minutes Raw. Karen wasn't there. The interim chair, cheeks flushed with the awkwardness of someone newly appointed to a broken crown, slid the box forward. Interim says, "You'll have copies. Originals. Remain here." Marcus replies, "Scan them with witnesses present." The interim nodded. Interim says, "Agreed." The copier hummed as if relieved to be doing honest work. As pages slid under glass and came out warm, the door opened quietly. Karen stood in the frame, not crossing inside. The fluorescent lights made her look tired, not dangerous. Karen says, "I'll be leaving the board." Marcus replies, "Leave the habits with it." She looked at the stack of minutes, then at the gavel that lay on its side like a tool someone forgot to put away. Karen says, "I thought silence would keep this simple." Marcus replies, "Silence kept it cruel." A group of neighbors filtered in, some speaking softly about elections, some about audits, some just standing near the door like people who finally understood a threshold. The lawyer checked the time. Lawyer says, "We'll file our motion by Friday." Marcus replies, "And then we'll file memory too." The lawyer looked at him, curious. Lawyer says, "Memory?" Marcus replies, "What we all forgot to keep." They finished scanning as the building settled into night. When he stepped back into the air, the storm had emptied itself. Puddles mirrored fences and street lamps, every reflection a better version of order than the one ink had tried to enforce. He walked home carrying a thin, heavy stack, the kind of weight that doesn't bend the spine so much as straighten it. At his porch, he paused. The mailbox sat beneath the light, quiet for once. He opened it anyway. Inside was a single plain envelope with no return address, the flap sealed too neatly. He turned it over in his hands and, for a beat, didn't move. From the sidewalk. 2 neighbors watched, not with dread this time, but with a taut attention that felt like a promise. Neighbor says, "What is it?" He looked at the envelope, then at the fence. then at the door that had once worn a threat like a badge. Marcus replies, "It's the last thing they can send." He slid a finger under the flap, inhaled, and lifted the lid of his past one more time as the neighborhood held its breath, waiting to see whether paper would finally surrender to truth, or try one last time to outlast it. The neighborhood woke to a quieter sky. The storm rinsed off the fences so they shone like clean bones. Doors opened with a softness that hadn't been heard in weeks. The mailbox lids rested flat for once, and the air felt less staged, less rehearsed. He stepped onto his porch and touched the faint square on the wood where a notice had once clung like a threat. The door felt solid now, not because paper said so, but because silence had finally been made to speak. Across the street, neighbors gathered near the corner fence, their voices a hush that no longer hid. Resident says, "So, what happens now?" Another glanced at the white slats, the sunlight skipping along them. Resident says, "Now we find out who we are when no one's watching." A child traced a finger along the fence rail as if reading a sentence he couldn't pronounce yet. The symbol held steady. Borders that once pretended to keep order now read like a question. The board posted an emergency notice. Records production, resignations, interim committee. Words that had once been weapons now sounded like repair instructions. He carried a binder to the community hall where a copy machine waited like a contrite witness. The gavel lay sideways on the front table, the handle pointing nowhere. Phones were allowed today. The crowd stood close, not to suffocate, but to see. The interim chair cleared his throat. Interim says, "We'll proceed page by page. No redactions outside the law." Marcus replies, "And the law will be read out loud." A ripple of agreement moved through the room like wind through a curtain. The machine hummed, paper slid, warmed, and stacked into honest piles. The pen that had once signed lies now scribbled acknowledgments. Date, time, witnesses present. A man approached who had once avoided his gaze in the aisle. Neighbor says, "I didn't know what to say before." Marcus replies, "You do now." The man nodded, eyes on the gavel that hadn't moved. Neighbor says, "It should mean something again." Marcus replies, "Make it mean something." Online, the viral clip kept breathing. A reporter's thread turned into a map, screenshots of emails, stills of faces when truth landed, a slow zoom on the retainer agreement like a document signed by a new weather. Comments scrolled beneath. User says, "Silence is a policy." User says, "Accountability is louder." Someone posted a split image. On the left, a fence under rain. On the right, a pen hovering over a signature line. The caption read, "Choose your symbol." He walked the perimeter of his yard at dusk, fingertips brushing the fence. The wood felt less like a wall than a ledger, entries corrected, minus signs erased. A neighbor stepped out with a plate covered in foil, the kind of gesture communities remember when they try to rebuild. Neighbor says, "You don't have to take this." Marcus replies, "I will." She smiled, a little ashamed, a little grateful. Neighbor says, "I'm sorry I stayed out of it." Marcus replies, "Don't stay out of fixing it." At the next open meeting, the hall filled beyond capacity. People stood by the doors, leaned against the back wall, sat cross-legged near the aisles. The crowd no longer hid behind coughs or the shuffling of papers. They entered as a character with lines to deliver. The interim chair lifted the gavel carefully, as if it might bite. Interim says, "We have 3 items: resignations, audits, and policy reform." Marcus replies, "Add restitution, Karen." Wasn't at the table, but the empty chair she had once used felt occupied by consequence. The room waited. A woman raised her hand, voice steady. Resident says, "Were selective fees issued to certain households?" The interim swallowed. Interim says, "Preliminary review shows inconsistencies." Murmurs gathered and tightened. Resident says, then refund, publicly, with apologies. The interim nodded, pen hovering over the agenda. The ink looked heavier than before, as if it understood what it meant to leave a record. The county clerk stepped forward with certified copies. Clerk says, we'll host a session to explain recording processes. Paper protects best when it's seen. A teenager in the aisle raised his phone. Teen says, stream it. Heads nodded. The clerk didn't hesitate. Clerk says, we will. He presented calmly, not as a victor, but as a ledger balancing. Marcus says, policy changes in writing, transparent notice logs, public minutes with timestamps, independent audits each quarter. The interim chair scribbled, interim, says, we'll adopt them and ask you to help draft. For a beat, the crowd froze, surprised by a door opening without argument. Marcus replies, I will, but the crowd writes with me. Neighbors who had once closed their doors stood at the mic. Neighbor says, I believed lies because they were printed. Another clasped, shaking hands. Neighbor says, I thought silence kept peace. A third exhaled like a confession. Neighbor says, it kept a lie alive. The hall held those words without hurry, letting them find their place like stones finally sinking to the riverbed where they belonged. A flashback cut sharp and brief. Black and white footage of a kitchen table from decades ago, a grandmother smoothing a crumpled notice against the wood while two children watched. Her fingers traced the red stamp. Delinquent. She didn't cry. She packed. The image dimmed. The present brightened. The crowd in this hall didn't pack. They stayed. He spoke one last time, fingers resting lightly on the binder, a pen glinting. Marcus says, keep the door open, keep the minutes honest, keep the gavel patient, and when paper tries to walk alone, make it produce a witness. The line landed like a small bell. A toddler clapped without knowing why, and the room smiled without permission. Outside, the fences carried light along their rails as the sun lowered. People didn't scatter this time. They lingered in clusters that sounded like work. Volunteers signed up for committees. A retired IT specialist offered to secure server logs. 2 high schoolers proposed a public dashboard that tracked notices, the way weather is tracked, openly, predictably, with warnings that arrive before harm does. Karen stood at the edge of the lot, ready to leave with a box under her arm. She paused when he approached. Karen says, you won. Marcus replies, I learned. She looked toward the hall where the crowd still moved like a single intention. Karen says, they won't forget this. Marcus replies, that's the point. She gave a small nod that tried to be brave. Karen says, I thought fear would keep me safe. Marcus replies, respect lasts longer. She left without haste, the box square, the evening long. The management company sent an email that didn't hide behind passive voice. A plan for refunds, a timeline for audits, an apology that didn't use the word if. The message arrived like rain that meant something. He printed it out and pinned it to the wall near the first notice they'd taped to his door. On one side, a threat. On the other, a pledge. The wall looked like a before and after that wasn't cosmetic but structural, local. News aired a follow-up. The anchor didn't vamp. She let the footage tell it, the lawyer taking his seat beside him, the clerk's certification, the officer's suspension of foreclosure, the crowd turning from furniture into force. A closing line floated through living rooms. In this neighborhood, silence was tried and found guilty. People watched over dinner and looked at their own fences, their own committees, their own inboxes where notices sometimes pretend to be truth. He walked the block at night, street lamps haloed, crickets audible for the first time in weeks. The crowd existed even in emptiness. You could sense it in the way curtains didn't twitch to hide, but to open. He paused by a gate left ajar and clicked it shut with 2 fingers. It latched with a clean sound that felt like punctuation at the end of a chapter that had taken too long to write. The next weekend, the hall filled again, this time for elections. Names were offered with resumes and also with apologies. Candidate says, "I served once and stayed quiet. I won't again." Another stood with a notebook speckled by rain. Candidate says, "Every vote will be recorded live." A third smiled like someone who had learned how to carry weight. Candidate says, "Policy is a promise we make in public." Ballots dropped into a clear box. The pen that marked each line felt less like a blade and more like a bridge. Afterward, as results were tallied in plain sight, a boy tugged his mother's sleeve and pointed at the gavel. Boy says, "What's that?" She bent low. Mother says, "Something that means more when we're watching." The officer, no longer required but invited as a guest, turned the gavel upright with a fingertip, not to strike, but to remind. He returned home to find his mailbox empty, except for a single postcard. A picture of the old courthouse downtown, pillars and doors and a sky too blue to be trusted without witnesses. The back carried a short line from the county clerk. "Paper protects best when the crowd can read it." He placed it on the mantel beside the small thrift store gavel, the two objects not in opposition anymore, but in arrangement. By evening, the neighborhood looked almost like the one from the opening shot. Lawns tidy, fences clean, mailboxes obedient, yet nothing was the same. The crowd had learned its lines. The doors had learned to stay open. The pen had learned to ask for a second pen. When the wind rose, it wasn't a storm. It was the sound of people speaking at the speed of truth. On his porch, two neighbors stood with folded documents in hand, refund confirmations. Neighbor says, "It's not the money." Marcus replies, "It's the record." The other nodded toward the hall. Neighbor says, "We saved 2 seats for you on the policy committee." He smiled, small and real. Marcus replies, "Ali, bring a pen." They laughed lightly, not to hide anything, but because some weights deserve their echo. He looked once more at the fence. In the opening days, it had whispered division. Tonight it whispered the opposite. Lines that are honored when they are chosen together, and crossed loudly when they are not. He traced the top rail with a palm and remembered the first envelope, the first silence, the first gavel pretending to be law. Every symbol stood now in a different light. The fence, not a wall, the door, not a muzzle, the pen, not a threat, the gavel, not an echo, the crowd, not a backdrop. The camera of memory drew one last flashback. A younger him building a folder labeled evidence under a cheap lamp, while rain hit the window with a menace that felt personal. The cut returned to the present, a brighter room, a wall of documents that no longer needed to defend, only to teach. He pulled the pushpins free one by one. The holes left behind were tiny, honest, and harmless. At the final community session of the month, he stood by the back door while others spoke first. The interim committee became a board without the word interim, and no one clapped at the wrong moments. They clapped at the right ones, when rules were named, when minutes were promised, when silence was called out by its new name, cowardice. He didn't speak until the end, and even then he kept it brief. Marcus says, "We keep fences painted. We keep doors unlocked to daylight. We keep pens paired with witnesses. We keep gavels for truth, not for thunder. And we keep the crowd awake." The room didn't erupt. It settled deeply, like soil after rain. He walked home in the soft end of day. The street tasted clean. The fence caught the last light and threw it back with a courage it hadn't known it possessed. He paused by the mailbox, opened it for ceremony, and smiled at its quiet. The door opened with a familiar hinge, no square of threat on its face, only the faint ghost of one, useful to remember, necessary to outgrow. He turned to the camera that isn't there and is always there, the one that films every neighborhood, in case we need to learn from it. The first symbol waited at his shoulder, freshly painted, steady as a vow. He rested a hand on the fence and spoke to the silence that once mistook itself for safety, then to the crowd that no longer would. Marcus says, "The choice is left with us. Comment your answer below."